The D-Day invasion has remained to this day a fascinating operation, not just because of its size and the number of troops, but also because of its sheer audacity. It was a bit risky then, and such an operation would be even riskier today. So what would a present-day invasion on the same battlefield but against a hypothetical modern-day enemy look like? Could it even be as big as the true D-Day was? Would it be bloodier? And would it even be possible to pull it off successfully? Commanding a modern D-Day invasion is something that you can try out yourself by playing Conflict of Nations, sponsoring this video. It's a free-to-play military-themed strategy game set in the early 21st century. You, the player, pick an existing real country and lead it to victory. Against you are up to 128 real human players. You all battle to dominate the world. Best of all, Conflict of Nations is done in real time. I love that units can take hours to perform their missions. Planning needs to be done carefully and well in advance. Some matches can take weeks to complete. I love the pace. I can log into an ongoing match a few times a day to check how I'm doing and to issue new orders. There's a huge text tree to research. There's diplomacy, alliances and trading game. You can play Conflict of Nations with the same account on both PC or mobile. And if you click the link in the description, you'll get an exclusive gift. 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Go on, lead your country to victory. On to our video. There are many ways to set up a scenario like this one, but we will have to pick one. So we will have just a year of prep time, and our invading force stationed in Britain will muster whatever it can within reason to attack a defending force that occupies France. Said defender will have the number of troops and equipment similar to the ratio of Nazi Germany numbers to the Allies' numbers in France in 1944. Of course, equipment technology of both sides will be roughly on par to simulate the technological similarity of Germany and the Allies in 1944. The Allied force today will be made up of US, British, Canadian and Australian troops, likely in different force ratios than actual 1944 numbers. The 1944 invasion had years of wartime production going for it. Entire fleets of landing craft were created and a huge number of planes were made available by that time. Our invasion will have none of that. In Binkov's opinion, it's more interesting to see what the said countries could assemble on a somewhat short notice. So first off, would there be a surprise attack? Even back in 1944, strategically there was no surprise. Germany had enough intel to know an attack was incoming. But they didn't know the exact timing nor the location of the landing. That sort of surprise is not going to be possible nowadays. While the defenders still won't know well in advance when the attack will come, they will likely know the forces across the channel have started departing some 24 hours or so in advance. In 2023, the defender of the industrial and technological tier that Germany had in 1944 would today have recon satellites at its disposal. Because remember, there's no years of wartime attrition in our scenario. Furthermore, even third-party countries not directly involved in the war would have either some of their own satellites or their private firms would operate satellites. While one might muse that the attacker would take down all satellites beforehand, that's not really likely. If you'd like to know why, feel free to check out the more detailed text of this scenario. It expands on many more segments of this video. We've provided it via the link below in the video description. All in all, defenders would know where the staging areas are. That would make the likely area where landing could happen smaller. It's also likely the modern enemy would know due to increased commotion that invasion launch is imminent with a day or so in advance, and would even quite likely be able to get photos, be it by satellites or by some dumb locals sharing images of many ships being assembled near ports or at sea. Even satellite imagery of actual ship convoys en route to Normandy would be possible. While optical sensor satellites can't see through clouds or at night, today an ever greater number of satellites, even commercial ones, use radar-based synthetic imagery of high resolution. But before we get to the landings, let's talk a little about air forces. Back in 1944, the Allies used almost 10,000 aircraft over Normandy on D-Day, of which over 6,000 were combat ones. Even if we combine the entire force inventories of US, Britain, Canada and Australia, would not come close to some of the numbers the Allies actually used over Normandy. And realistically, at least some of today's Allied forces would have to remain elsewhere. Then there's the maintenance need. For example, out of 100 planes, it's not likely more than 70 or 80 could even be sent on any sort of a mission. But let's say for argument's sake that there aren't many other engagements around the world, and that indeed the invaders managed to use 2/3 of their force in this 2023 invasion of Normandy. On paper, they would still have a very large force. When it comes to planes, all those could eventually find room in Britain, with several hundred potentially operating from aircraft carriers. Given that total plane numbers represent 44% of the Allied combat planes over Normandy in 1944, we will also cut the number of planes opposing them accordingly. German planes were very low in numbers and dispersed over a large area, tasked to defend France and Belgium. Covering a large area would be somewhat easier for modern planes. In 2023, the Defender would thus operate some 180 tactical combat planes in the area initially. Unlike in 1944, planes on both sides would largely be multi-role, which benefits the Defender a bit more, as the Invader would need to use lots of their planes for ground attacks, but at the same time always have some configured as fighter escorts. The Defender could afford to use pretty much all of their planes as fighters, unless an opportunity presents itself to try and strike the incoming landing ships. Though, as in 1944, the Defender would also be getting reinforcements. With less surprise this time around, it's likely that part of the reinforcements could actually be at hand even hours before first landings happen. Furthermore, back in 1944, fighter planes would often fly higher than the ground attack planes, less exposed to anti-air fire. Today, with SAMs, both high-flying and low-flying planes would be threatened by anti-air defenses. Suffice it to say that overall the Allies today would have a somewhat harder time in the air than the Allies of 1944, with some more losses. So what sort of ground forces could the modern-day coalition of attackers land? All of the troops and vehicles would need to be ferried by ships and planes. But current amphibious assault fleets simply aren't that big, as they lack prior years of wartime production. Here's what they nominally have between all four countries. These figures include both the US and UK's reserve fleet, as those could very much be activated in time. While their long-range capacities are lower, for a short mission over the Channel, all those ships would be carrying more troops. The grand total is, however, still fairly unimpressive. Ships, like planes, need time for maintenance. Even if the invasion fleet would be carefully managed to plan maintenance in advance, it's simply not realistic to expect that more than 3/4 of the shown fleet could actually be available for use. The invaders' preparatory air campaign against enemy air forces and suppression of air defenses might produce fairly clear skies. After all, if most runways are ruptured and closed down, the enemy couldn't fly often, and high-reach surface-to-air missiles require fairly large vehicles, which would be easier to spot. Most would likely get engaged months before the invasion. Air power would be one big advantage for the invader compared to their 1944 counterparts. Sure, we said that today's air forces would have over 2.5 times fewer combat planes over Normandy during the first day, but those planes, configured for ground strikes, would on average be much more efficient at said mission. Today's technology means that recon prior to invasion day would yield better and more precise locations of enemy forces. Planes themselves would be able to target individual vehicles from long distances by using targeting pods. And guided weapons would mean that far fewer sorties would be needed to destroy the opponent's forces from the air. Today's amphibious assault ships usually stay a few dozen miles away, enough that part of the threats simply can't reach them, like artillery fire. Anti-ship missiles are a threat nowadays, like any guided missile. Those weren't a factor in 1944, but even today one needs to first spot a contact, identify it, and then relay that information to the missile unit so the missile can be fired. One of the invading force's main tasks would be to keep the enemy aircraft away, because if an enemy plane could get airborne, it could theoretically monitor incoming ships from a few hundred miles away. While some long-range anti-ship missiles would still find their way, it's likely that the air campaign preceding the actual invasion would make sure those would be only sporadic events. Missile attacks on the landing boats and vehicles, however, would be much harder to stop. Managing to locate small portable radars near the coast would be much harder, and optical sensors, be they on vehicles or small, slow and hard-to-track drones, would be able to spot a mass column of landing craft from a dozen miles away. With such high-power optical sensors being prevalent on pretty much every combat vehicle and even on small drones, the defenders would have plenty of opportunity to get alerted, pinpointing the exact location of the landing force. But the actual smaller landing craft that would come out of those big amphibious assault ships, and especially the amphibious vehicles, would be fairly slow. Slow enough that over a 24-mile distance, for example, they would need between 1.5 to 2.5 hours to actually get to the beach. The only exception would be the hovercraft. The US is using those, and they could cross that distance, fully loaded, within 35 minutes. Of course, not all of those landing craft would be used just from the landing ships. Some of the hovercraft might actually be used for direct trips from Britain to Normandy. So what would happen is that the big amphibious ships would get parked a bit away from most direct threats, like artillery fire, and then their landing craft would make round trips until those big ships unload everything they carry. That in itself might require a few such round trips. Even the US Army's big LCU-2000 ships, which are generally not meant to be used for opposed landings, might in this scenario be doing just that. But even using all those as well, it's not likely that the very first wave of troops on the beaches would manage to disembark more than 30,000 troops with their equipment. A few hours later, some 15,000 more might join them, after which most of the big landing ships would need to travel home. Perhaps only the hovercraft would be able to do 3 or 4 round trips within the first day, and the big amphibious assault ships would likely do 2 or so trips, and the LCU-2000 ships would likely not manage a second run within the first 24 hours. All in all, if 0 ships run into trouble, break down or get damaged or destroyed, up to 90,000 troops might disembark onto Normandy via military vessels on that first day. Of course, just like in 1944, there would be other ships used, not just military ones. While it's possible for the military to commandeer thousands of various boats and yachts, organizing those would be more trouble than they're worth. There's only a fairly small subset of civilian car ferries that would be worth the effort of using them. So in reality, it's not plausible that more than a few hundred small ferries with several tens of thousands of troops would actually be added to the military force. But amphibious landings are just part of the invasion. Back in 1944, there were paratroopers and air assault troops flown in by gliders as well. Over 24,000 troops altogether. Those combined airborne landing troops constituted 15% of the overall troops sent to land on Normandy. Today, the technology and fleets for airborne assaults are a little different. Instead of gliders, air assault is today done by helicopters. Many helicopters today can carry as many troops as gliders did in 1944, with even more equipment carried in a sling under the helicopter. Today's transport planes are also generally much bigger. In 1944, roughly some 3,000 transports and gliders were used for the air assaults, landing those 24,000 troops and various equipment. Today's fleets of such air transports have the capacity to be much bigger. The list shown doesn't even include all aircraft, like huge C-5 Galaxy planes or many special mission helicopters not likely to be used for airborne assaults. Of course, a lot of the planes on the list would be needed for logistics purposes. Many helicopters too would be needed elsewhere, and some would always be under maintenance. But if the said invasion is the most important battle, the Allies would likely be able to pull up roughly half of the shown numbers and use them for actual airborne and helicopter assaults. Not counting the US Marines, the 4 countries have some 40,000 troops trained for such operations. It's assured that the Allies would be using that 1 year of prep time to train even more troops. But ultimately, it would take many trips over the channel to transport so many troops. So the overall combined number of troops in landing vessels and various aircraft en route to Normandy during the first day would likely amount to even more troops than on 1944 D-Day, possibly even 190,000 if there is the 1 year prep. But it would be a much more deadly environment today. Back in 1944, very few planes or gliders did not reach their destination. Out of almost 7,000 ships, craft and barges of all kinds, only 200 were lost. many due to weather and error rather than enemy fire. All in all, the Allies lost roughly 4,500 people during D-Day. Most of those deaths were during combat after the landings. But the modern-day invasion will likely suffer higher casualties even among the troops not yet reaching the land. The proliferation of sensors in modern militaries would mean those landing craft would get tracked over a dozen miles away. First, the sea mines that the attacker would not manage to detonate remotely would get some of the craft. Then the artillery would be shooting both guided and unguided rounds at them. Attack helicopters and armed drones would also likely make their attack round then. Using them earlier would mean they would have to expose themselves too much over the sea, but flying low over the ground clutter, they would be harder to spot for the invader, yet still enjoy several mile reach for their guided missiles. Various loitering suicide drones could be used in numbers, as we've seen in the recent war, like the famous Switchblade drones, as well as non-line-of-sight anti-tank missiles, like the Israeli-designed Spike NLAWs. Finally, as the landing craft and vehicles get to just a few miles away from the shore, they would get engaged by likely very plentiful anti-tank guided missiles and direct gunfire, like from tanks and medium-caliber autocannons. Systems similar to NLAW, made famous in recent conflicts, would be quite useful if available. A disadvantage for modern-day landing craft is their size. They carry more troops per craft, alright, but that also means if they're sunk, more troops would go down with them. On the flip side, today's force has more combat amphibious vehicles. In total, a modern force presents between 2 and 3.5 fewer targets to the enemy. To sum it up, most of those landing craft and vehicles aren't really much more mobile or maneuverable than their counterparts in 1944. Yet today's sensors and weapons enable the defender to engage them with much greater accuracy. Where in 1944 maybe 100 artillery shells would be needed to achieve one lucky hit, today with GPS guidance the average would be just a few. The defender's helicopters could operate from fairly far away from the beaches, from clearings that are hard to find, drones as well, or they could be so small that they could be launched from otherwise hidden vehicles. And shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile units would be almost impossible to find. Indeed, those would likely wreak absolute havoc on invading helicopters. Paratroopers would likely fare better initially due to not as many long-reach anti-air assets left over, so not many transport planes might be shot down. Still, paratroopers are by default the lightest equipped of all troops. Once on the ground, they would largely lack heavy weapons, armored protection, or even plentiful vehicles. While the US paratroopers do train to drop Humvees or even bigger vehicles, those would not likely be nearly plentiful enough. Helicopters are in theory better there, as they could regularly carry Humvees, artillery and supplies slung underneath them. But in practice, such loads are not carried directly into a zone where the enemy is shooting at you. It's likely that literally tens of thousands of troops would struggle after their boats and craft would sink or their helicopters crash land before the rest managed to disembark properly. Waiting to engage them would be, as scenario stipulates, the same ratio of enemies as in 1944, adjusted for the size of the invader's force. In 1944, Germany had a roughly 3 times smaller force opposing the Allies. There were of course many German units in France and especially alongside the Atlantic Wall, but those were dispersed, and virtually none could be moved to Normandy within the first 24 hours. So our hypothetical defender will thus have a little under 60,000 troops near the beaches just before the invasion starts. Of course, the equipment would be more modern. Defender's tanks would be equivalent to Abrams, Leo 2 and T-90 tanks. Perhaps more importantly, the defender would, due to better intel and more warning time, be bringing reinforcements right from the start of the invasion, unlike in 1944, where it took a day for that process to start properly. So throughout the day the defender would increase its troop levels to possibly over 140,000. Of course, that too doesn't include defenders' losses en route. Once those reinforcements start moving, they would be easier to spot and engaged by the attacker. So it's likely hundreds of various trucks and armored vehicles would be destroyed by the attacker's air power. The whole point is, today's invasion of Normandy under similar conditions and force equivalents would mean a much bloodier battle, and many more casualties for the attacker. After a few tens of thousands dead before the landings, and likely a few more tens of thousands dead in ground battles around the beaches themselves, the attacker would likely still prevail. The numbers difference, especially one in the air, would still make sure of that. But no sane person would risk such losses today. Unless the invasion is absolutely time critical, the attacker would simply wait several more months, or even a year, and use its numerical advantage to grind down the defender from the air, bombing both his industry and forces in France. Today's technology, satellites, standoff recon planes, standoff missiles, and generally better targeting and accuracy allows that to be done quicker and more efficiently compared to 1944. But until you have several times more air power than the enemy locally, you can forget about it. Before we go, a few more details on Conflict of Nations. There are several game modes, all played on different maps. You want future global war, or Cold War gone hot, or a civil war in the US? Pick your favorite. The game features many different units with over 250 items to research. Airborne infantry, stealth jets, nuclear subs, they're all there. Even nuclear weapons. Watch out, their consequences are simulated with lasting effects on both population and economy. And you definitely don't want to forget about the economy. It's resource-driven and population numbers and morale are a thing. You can forge alliances with other players. The choice of strategy is up to you really. And don't forget about that exclusive gift. If you click the link in the description, you'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. That offer is available for 30 days only, so don't lose time. Pick your country and dominate the world. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.